now is the conversation component of the evening, and then I do want to give ample time to open up the floor. So I've actually cut out one of my questions. I've heard a couple of controversial things so far. I want you to know, as far as I'm concerned, you're in a safe place. We're not going to put you in Cherem tonight. What other congregations do is another matter entirely.
I've been working all my life to be put in Cherem. Please.
So the first question is really is a two-part question, and it addresses two issues that we need to talk about whenever we are discussing studying Maimonides. The two words are esotericism and polemics. A common theme in both of your books is the idea of esoteric writing, which of course Leo Strauss, Ken Green specialty, wrote a lot about. It's a prevalent style in the ancient and medieval world where an author, for a variety of reasons, may have felt a need to obfuscate, to obscure the true nature of what he was saying. Dr. Friedberg, this comes across in your book when you suggest that there was a covert agenda that the Rambam had in writing the Sefer HaMitzvahs, namely to introduce theology and dogma to Judaism, and that the Rambam used different verbiage in the Yad when describing certain mitzvot as a way of either emphasizing or de-emphasizing the imperative nature of a mitzvah, as you just discussed. And Dr. Diamond, this esotericism comes across. You make reference to the Rambam's citation of a pasuk in Mishlei chapter 25, Tapuchei zahav b'maskuyot kesef davar dabur al ofnav. A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in a setting of silver, that many times you have to hide the true meaning of what you mean, and this is what really has stimulated so much discussion in the commentators of the Rambam and those who have had to respond to the Rambam. So can I ask you both, please, to elaborate on this idea of esoteric writing in the Rambam, and how much esotericism exists within the respective works of the Rambam? Also, how does this idea of esoteric writing affect the way that a person should study the Rambam in the Beis Medrash? Because ultimately we are an Orthodox community. We're sending our children off to the Beis Medrash to learn one of the topics, one of the studies, one of the sparm they're going to be studying is the Rambam. When they come out learning, if a young man or a young lady reads Dr. Friedberg's book and notices that there's some secrets that are embedded in the Sefer HaMitzvahs, how is that going to affect the way that they're going to approach their learning, especially other works of the Rambam? So you each have your microphones, so please, whoever would like to go first. You probably, it's right next to you on your seat.
Oh.
Okay.
Go ahead. I have to find my microphone.
Is it working? Yeah. First of all, on the question of a very large topic, but the Rambam, at least in the guide, and maybe we'll talk about the Mishnah Torah. In the guide, he says explicitly that he's going to write esoterically. So it kind of boggles my mind sometimes how people say there is no esotericism. He says himself there are two reasons, two types of contradictions appear in works. One is pedagogical, I won't talk about that too much. But one is an intentional contradiction. That is, he says, I'm going to write this book, the guide, with respect to topics that are actually esoteric topics themselves, topics that he considers to be Masa Breshit, the account of the creation, physics for him, and Masa Merkava, the account of the chariot, the first chapter in Ezekiel, which is for him metaphysics, the account of everything beyond physics. So when I approach these subjects, I have actually two problems. There are two problems. Sometimes people miss these problems, which makes me write about it in a way that most people won't be able to have access to this book. Right? One reason is actually a halachic problem, because rabbinically, I'm not allowed to teach these subjects. Those who are familiar with the Gemara and Chagiga, that I can't teach these subjects to the public. But I'm writing a book. I know, actually, he didn't even write a book. He kind of fucked a little bit. He said, I'm writing really a letter. I'm writing a letter to my private student So it's actually a confidential letter. You're not supposed to read letters. But I know that this letter is going to be read by a lot of people. And therefore, I have a halachic problem that I can't teach these openly. So that's one reason why I'm going to talk about it in this esoteric way.
But the guide also contains Maisa Merkava and Maisa.
Right. So that's right. So the guide is about Maisa Merkava and Maisa Breshit. That's what I'm talking about. The guide, and therefore those two topics are the substance of that book.
But the Yad also. I'm saying in Hilchos Yisodei Torah, he also opens up the entire Mishnah Torah
right.
with those two topics.
Right. So far I was talking about the guide. And the Yad opens up with that. And there also, he's speaking esoterically. In fact, there are scholars who think, one of the great scholars of Maimonides, one of the great scholars of Jewish thought in the last generation, actually thought that the Yad, in the beginning of the Yad, is more esoteric than the guide. That actually, he is more radical in the Hilchot Yisodei Torah, the foundations of the Torah, than he is in the guide. And he softened his positions in the guide. Now, let me just give an example so this is to be concrete. If you start with, as Dov was talking about mitzvot, you start with, in the Koteret, in the heading of each section in Mishnah Torah, he starts with a listing of the commandments that will be discussed in that section. This one starts off with Leida Sheyesham Elokai, right? The first mitzvah is to know, of course that's important, Leida, not laham, not to believe. And the forests that have been cut down on the contradiction, supposedly, between what he says here and the Sefer Mitzvot, where he says lahamim, are really nonsense because, where he says to believe, because many people who give those drushes don't know that they're written in different languages, and you can't really. The Sefer Mitzvot was written in Judeo-Arabic, and this was written in Hebrew. And in fact, the word that's used for lahamim, that was translated by Yehuda Tibbon, to believe in Sefer Mitzvot, actually can mean leida. Actually can mean to know. But let's look at it for a second. He starts off, that's the mitzvah. Then he says, Yisod ha-yisodot v'amud ha-chochmot. There you already have kind of embedded in it, you have the word, name of God. Yud Kei Vav Kei, right? Yud Kei Vav Kei starts off each of these words. But what is it to know? Not to know that there's a God. There's not Yisod of the Torah. There's not Amud, there's not the pillar of Jewish wisdom. There's not the foundation of Jewishness. There is simply the foundation of all foundations. This is the beginning of a code of law. You're not going to find this in the Shulchan Aruch, right? You're not going to find this in the Shulchan Aruch, which is an example of why this is so different than the Shulchan Aruch, right? And maybe why the Shulchan Aruch caught on, and not the Mishnah Torah. Shulchan Aruch, of course, is modeled on the Mishnah Torah, but starts off with a universal idea, and then to know what? To know that there is a Matsui Rishon. So no Jewish wisdom, no Jewish Yisodot, no God even. To know that there is a prime existent, a philosophical formulation, an Aristotelian formulation that you can't possibly know what he's talking about unless you've studied actually Aristotle and Greek philosophy as transmitted through the Arabic philosophers. And then he defines that Matsui Rishon. By the way, you don't get to a mitzvah until the 6th paragraph. The first 5 paragraphs of the great code, the first code of Jewish law, right, deals with a universal point. A universal point that is accessible to all people, right? The Matsui Rishon is not a Jewish God. It's not even Yud Kei Vav Kei, right? So he already starts off with leading you somewhere. And by the way, he ends off, I think, the Hilchot Yisodei Torah. I'm not going to spend any more time because I want to give Dov some time, which I don't give him much when we're together. And he actually ends off Hilchot Yisodei Torah. The last, Sefer Hamada. The whole thing is called Sefer Hamada. By the way, it's called Sefer Hamada, the book that's usually translated, the book of knowledge. There's a great scholar called Professor Septimus who wrote, this is just to give you an idea of perhaps esotericism, perhaps simply, unless you know what you're talking about, you have no idea. So just the title of the book, Sefer Hamada. This professor wrote, I think it was a 75-page article on the word mada, and I still don't know what it means. I still don't know what precisely it means. But it's called Sefer HaMada. What kind of a code of law begins with the book of knowledge, what I need to know, what I need to, what I have to reason my way toward? What does that have to do with law? And that's why Yosef Karo just left it out entirely. I mean, there is nothing of that. And this is, it's interspersed. Mishneh Torah has this periodically all over the place. So just one final point. Esotericism in the Mishneh Torah, esotericism in the guide for sure, because he actually explicitly says. And esotericism, why obfuscation? Because again, I think I mentioned it, on virtually every tenet that's crucial to Jewish faith, God, as rudimentary as God, the nature of God, hashgacha, providence, reward, angels, the creation of the world, everything. He is taking positions which he knows are not the traditional accepted positions. And therefore, and he doesn't want to really upset people who are not upset to begin with. If you're not upset to begin with and not troubled, then you won't be able to read this book.
One second. You're saying the Rambam did not want to upset his opponents?
He wanted to upset the opponents that opposed him. But when he wrote the guide, he wasn't out to introduce problems for people who didn't find let's say the Torah as speaking in a problematic language. He wasn't interested in that.
Okay.
He wasn't interested in that.
But the Mishneh Torah?
And the Mishneh Torah, he wanted to ground people at least in, I think what they would get out of, for instance, Hilchot Yisodei Torah, would be at least a fundamental, like the Yud Gimel Ikrim, right? What are they? Those are stripped down versions of the entire guide and the entire Mishneh Torah kind of. So he wants you to have at least a rudimentary knowledge of these things, right? So he wants everybody to have a basis, but he doesn't want to introduce problems. This is a guide of the perplexed, people who are perplexed, and he describes them at the beginning. The crowd that is not perplexed, that don't come to the table with a solid background in Yiddishkeit, let's say. He wouldn't use that word, obviously, but a solid background in Yiddishkeit, and a solid background in philosophy. And therefore, when they come to the tradition, there are problems, right? If they don't have those problems, he doesn't want to create those problems for him. It's a different thing than saying, oppose my opponents, but he doesn't want to create problems for people who don't have them.
But nonetheless, the Rambam's introduction of dogma is saturated not just in the guide, but throughout his writings, as Dr. Friedberg talks about. So let me pass this over to Dr. Friedberg and ask you the same question. What is your take on the Rambam's esoteric style of writing, especially as you talk about the introduction of dogma in the Sefer HaMitzvot, and really the Rambam's apparent adoption of the Greek philosophical method of the emphasis on intellect as being a major component of our avodah, as the way that we serve Hashem?
I would say that his esotericism, at least in the halachic works. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
The esotericism is more in what he doesn't say than what he says. That's more likely to be found. He will not say something that is not correct, and whatever he says can be understood in 2 or 3 different levels. And if you are a simple person, then you'll understand at level 1. And if you are more refined, you'll understand at level 2 or level 3. So he's not putting something over you, and he's not telling a story. And I think in the piece even that I quoted, you can hear me?
Now you
can. Yeah. Thank you. What I'm saying is that he doesn't. The important thing is he tells you something, and that what he tells you can be understood in different ways, in 1 or 2 or 3 levels. And that what's more important very often is what he doesn't say. And I think that one part of the question was, how does it affect the Besmedrash? Well, the people learn Besmedrash. One of the ways that it affects it is when you're reading Rambam, try to think and see what he doesn't say. There's a lot of people who love to make diukim, and diukim is a very nice thing to do, and we have Brisker Torah, we have all kinds of Torah. I know I have a son who's a Brisker, so I know about diukim. But very often is what he doesn't say that's very important. So he's not putting something over you, but he wants you to think.
But isn't it difficult to make diukim from omissions? I mean, because a blank pause could be filled with anything, and so many things have been written about the Rambam that we have no idea whether they're even true or not, because they're precisely that. They're filling in blanks that the Rambam deliberately left blank.
No, it's true, and that's why you have to be very familiar with his writings, and very often it's highly speculative. Those are speculative enterprises.
A blank, I would say, maybe not so much, not just blanks, but for instance, when he's quoting psukim. What's very interesting is what he doesn't quote. That's what I find very interesting. In my first book, I talk a lot about that. But to give you just one example, again, of this, the first mitzvah, I don't think he ever quotes, right, the second half of the verse in the first of what we call the Ten Commandments. Anochi Hashem Elokecha. He always quotes that. He never quotes Asher Hotzeiticham Eretz Mitzrayim. That's, I think, maybe an important point. That is what he leaves out, because for him, the God that I know, right, the God that I reason to, is a God I come to through proofs, various proofs and demonstrations, through reasoning, through philosophy. It's not the God that I come to through one that intervenes in history. History is not important for the Rambam in terms of demonstrating God's existence. And this was what I was saying when I said two different models, whereas for the Ramban and for people like Yehuda Levi, right, the second part of the pasuk is precisely the important part. That is, what God does in history, the miracles he performs, are precisely those things. So there you have something that if you don't...
Even Ezra cut that pasuk in half.
That's right.
Precisely
right.
for that reason.
Right.
And he also only looked at the first part of the pasuk.
Right, and he actually talks about a conversation he had with Yehuda Levi, who asks him about that particular point. But people would miss that, right? If they don't really know the background, if they don't perhaps put together, I'm not saying everything in the Mishnah Torah can be put together with the guide, but clearly it's the same man that wrote both. And so this is something that you would only really note that's significant by reading his conception of God and his conception of how I arrive at the existence of God.
Why isn't the guide being studied more in the base medrash? Can you just speculate on that for a moment?
I think it's because we don't have enough of the tools. We don't have the tools. We don't know enough Aristotelian philosophy. We don't know enough Islamic philosophy. I mean, the Rambam drew very heavily on Islamic philosophers like Al-Farabi and Avicenna, and we just don't know enough. I mean, I have to say that I myself find myself not qualified very often to read some of the stuff that he writes. It's, you have to know the language. You have to know very well the language. The Arabic is technical, very technical. The words that are translated as one thing in 1200 meant something else. You have to have lexicons, dictionaries of generic Arabic of that period. It is complicated. It's very difficult to do. And I think that the yeshivas are probably right in not teaching it, because you would probably end up with the wrong impression.
But if I can take opposing, right? If that was the problem, right, then like everything else, they develop all the great tools, very intricate tools to study Talmud, right? So if they really wanted to, then they would develop the tools to read it. But you know as well as I do that it's definitely that, right? It's definitely they don't have the tools, but they don't want to have the tools, because from a general point of view, you could read the book and get some of the positions that he has, and virtually, like I said, positions that he has. Let's just throw a position on God, right? It becomes increasingly clear throughout the guide that and the way he interprets psukim, that this is not the traditional type of God that responds traditionally, that responds to prayer. It's not even clear that he believes in prayer. That is, what I mean by that, petitionary prayer, I mean, he clearly thinks that everything we say in prayer is actually false. When we daven Shemona Esrei and we say Hakel, Hagadol, Hagibor, Hagara, right? We're actually describing a false God. So he actually says at one point, for instance, there's a sentence, which is a very interesting sentence, for those who know his theory on korbanot, on sacrifices. He says for someone to come in his time and to say that we should do away with prayer and substitute it with silent contemplation, with meditation, would be like someone to come in Moshe's time and say, let's worship God, but we're going to get rid of the whole sacrificial cult and worship God in another way. Which means that he's saying...
Well, he says it the other way. So it's turned... No, it doesn't.
He says it's like somebody coming then and to say, get rid of korbanot, which
today would be like the same... Just only meditate and don't...
Right, which means lachat, and he mentions the verse lachat dumiyat, for you silence is praise. He really believes that to be silent about God, thinking about God, is the highest kind of praise for God, because everything we say about God is false. He says, thank God, and I'm paraphrasing, thank God that Chazal limited, right, the language. We can't go overboard, but they limited it. So we can, they said, okay, you can be false this much. But you have to know what you're saying. So there's one reason among a lot that I think...
the guide is not studied.
I think it's virtually ignored. And if it is taken up, it is often reread to be reconciled with traditional positions.
Okay, let me go on to the next question. We know that the Rambam was not the only medieval sage of the 12th century. Many other rabbis lived in the exact same time and in the exact same cultural and religious milieu as the Rambam, but took completely different approaches. Indeed, many have written about the dichotomous nature of the approach to Torah study and Jewish theology of the time, sometimes described as the Maimonides Yehuda Halevi dichotomy, especially regarding the attitude towards secular knowledge, towards Greek philosophy, as a prism for explaining Torah ideas, as well as the advent of Jewish mysticism during that period, which you touched upon, Dr. Friedberg. The Rambam completely ignored Jewish mysticism, whereas it was on the rise in many, many other rabbinic sages' writings of the time. So my question to the both of you is, what brought the Rambam to his unique approach? And do you think he got it right, or were the other rabbinic voices who opposed the Rambam more correct?
I have to say one first, because otherwise I can't even follow. It's interesting. In the introduction to the third part of the guide, he speaks about the fact that this book is really about Ma'aseh Merkava and Ma'aseh Bereishis, which is the two secrets of the law, he calls them, right? Ma'aseh Merkava is metaphysics and natural law, or the creation. And he says that those are very secret things, those are very profound matters. He says, and the knowledge of these things was lost, because by the nature of it, it was given from person to person, one person to one person. That's a halacha, you cannot speak about it in public. And over time, it was lost. So, in his understanding, the Masorah for these deep matters, the Masorah for these deep philosophical matters was lost. So Rambam starts fresh, and he says, I'm reconstructing now. I'm reconstructing this whole thing on the basis of my knowledge, my premises, and what I understand from Chazal. So here we have Rambam coming from a tabula rasa, a complete zero. He begins from zero, and he builds his philosophy. He builds his metaphysics as it applies to us. Whereas Ramban or Yehuda Levi or any of the Kabbalists, they claim for themselves a Masorah going back to Tanaitic period or even before. Some say to the time of Moshe and Sinai. So right there you have an enormous difference between the two positions. One has no Masorah, no Masorah, and the other one has a Masorah.
And so now the question is, who is right? Or I'm not going to be the one who decides who is right. I don't know, and I'm not sure anybody can decide who is right. One thing that the Rambam does
He's right.
He's
right. Come on.
Leaving aside some subjective thoughts, but one of the things that the Rambam does do for us is he gives you a way of thinking about it that is ever present. It can be used today, it can be used 100 years ago, it could be used all the time. He allows you to interpret, right? He's an interpreter par excellence. He will take any piece of Chazal, any piece of Agarata, any piece of Chumash, and he will harmonize it with reason and with science.
But Dr. Dov, do you really think that the Rambam didn't have the same Mesorah information that the Ramban and Rabbi Yehuda Halevi had?
Not when it came to metaphysics, no. Not when it came to those.
You just think he didn't have it, or is it possible that he had it but just rejected it?
I don't either he didn't have it, or if he had it, he must have, like you say, he must have thought that that's not correct. That's not.
Because there are, for example, Midrash.
He did not know the Zohar. That's clear. He did not know the Zohar.
Okay, but let's say Midrash Shi'ur Koma, for example. He said it's a Byzantine fabrication, right? Because it describes God in anthropomorphic terms, which he felt was unacceptable. So you see that there are times, it's not that the Rambam just had a tabula rasa, but there were times when he got certain information and he said, this doesn't fit in with my worldview of Judaism, of Torah, of my prism of Chazal, because it's not consistent with Aristotelianism, and therefore it can't be right.
Right. Well, that's true. I mean, there probably were certain works that he rejected on the basis of his understanding.
It's clear. It's actually clear. I think it's clear that though there are arguments whether he knew of Yehuda Halevi, right? Through his writings. But it's clear Yehuda Halevi was actually in that same area, right, where he lived, that he was familiar with the ideas that were floating around, and therefore in the guide already.
But he may not think that they're authoritative. He may not think they're authoritative.
No, but nothing's authoritative for him except the mind. Right. So he knew about, for instance, Halevian, let's say, notions of Shekhinah, let's say, right? Of a presence, of a divine presence that somehow, that still many people believe in, and I'm not, that there is kind of concrete presence, that there is a concrete presence. Let's say in Yerushalayim, that God's presence somehow is more there. That there is something that you can kind of on what's called ontological, right, about that. The Rambam, I think, in the guide, when he talks about terms like shachan, actually is doing battle with those kinds of ideas already, though not full-fledged battle with stuff that's going to come in the Zohar, because that's, of course, written later. But concepts like that he's already doing battle with. So it's not like, when you ask the question, what motivated him? I would say, well, it's simple to me. The truth motivated him. This is the truth for him. Obviously, he's influenced by his cultural milieu and he was interested in philosophy. But I'm not a historical reductionist. I don't believe that it's just a matter of history and his culture. He was convinced by the truth, right? And therefore, if this is the truth, right, he's convinced by the truth. And the truth for him was that there can be this kind of presence of, real presence of God that you can touch. There can't be angels. There can't be,
Yes, but the basis of his truth was his complete wholesale acceptance of Aristotelian philosophy. Would you not?
First of all, I don't think it was a wholesale. It's not a wholesale. He disagrees with them, and in fact, on an essential
with the exception of things that he found to be that he could not reconcile.
Well, no. He actually, by the way, even on creation, this is an interesting point when we say esotericism. Just going back to that question, here you have on the issue of creation, right? When he reflects on that subject, he explicitly endorses, seemingly explicitly says, "I'm going to accept our tradition on creation out of nothing." He explicitly rejects the Aristotelian position that the world is eternal. He kind of fudges on a Platonic position that there is some kind of this eternal thing.
So
right?
Herbert Davidson says that he wasn't really fudging on it, but he didn't want to fully concede it to the public because he didn't want to look like
right.
Nazi terrorists.
Exactly. So I was going to say that scholars have argued though he explicitly endorses one, explicitly rejects another, scholars argue for each one of those positions, that he really holds the position he explicitly rejects. But that's why this esotericism comes in, because it could very well be he believed the world was eternal. But on the eternality, he rejects Aristotle, which I always found fascinating. He rejects Aristotle only because he says Aristotle has not proven demonstrably, scientifically, that the world is eternal. And then he explicitly makes the statement, had he done that, or should someone come along and prove demonstrably that the world is eternal,
he would reread.
I would accept that, because the truth, right? The truth is not, there's not the truth.
No, he would reread.
He would reread the thing. But the truth, there's not the truth and Torah, right? Those aren't two different worlds. There's not Greek philosophy and Judaism. There's truth. Truth is Torah.
Right. But that only demonstrates that had he lived in the 21st century, his reading of so many of the things that he read through a prism of truth would be a totally different truth. Whereas perhaps for someone like Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, there's a timelessness to his theology that is not anchored in what's the prevalent idea of the time.
I think that's true.
Okay, I wouldn't disagree with that, but does the fact that it makes it timeless an idea somehow, is that a virtue? Is that I mean, okay, so you're right. I'm not going to argue with that.
Okay.
But
well, that's the point. I think he gives us the tools we wish to interpret a lot of the Chazal, a lot of the Psukim. We have tools how to do it.
Okay, I want to go to the last question of mine because I really do want to open the floor. This is not a spectator sport. So I want to get, my last question is to get a bit more personal with each of you. Dr. Diamond, you were a lawyer before pursuing an academic career. And so many admire the intellectual path that you've chosen in your life. So can
name names. Who? Not my mother, no.
So you mean not only rabbis have insecurities?
Okay, so can you please reflect upon how you arrived at this path, transitioning from a successful lawyer to intellectual and academic? By the way, being a lawyer is not the opposite of being intellectual, right? And why Maimonidean studies in particular has become your passion. And Dr. Friedberg, it is a source of pride to the Toronto Jewish community that you are known worldwide as a financial wizard and philanthropist par excellence. By the way, not only general philanthropic work, but specifically having to do with scholarly pursuits. There is not a day that goes by when I'm doing research that I am not benefiting from your direct efforts in making sure that we have electronic copies of so many important works that are accessible to me through the Bar Ilan CD, through the Talmudic, the
Hebrew books,
the HebrewBooks.org, and the Hebrew Encyclopedia Talmudit. So, what made you decide to pursue a PhD at this stage of your life and pull yourself away from all your other important work? How did you arrive at tackling the Rambam Sefer HaMitzvot above all else? And finally, for each of you, how has your academic study affected your orthodoxy and vice versa?
Okay. I have to say that maybe I was 15 years old and I was sitting in this marriage in Baltimore, and I had this big problem, this big question. I'm not sure exactly anymore what it was. I think it had to do with God's knowledge and free will. I think that had to do with that, but I'm not really sure. But I do remember one of the mashgichim come over to me, and he saw me sort of perplexed, and I was in mental agony, and he said to me, the Rambam asked this question. I said, "Oh, really?" He said, "Yeah, he asked this question, and he says that God's knowledge is different." I think that is what it was about. That I'm not sure 100%, but I remember feeling very good about it. I remember feeling that if somebody asked that question, he's asking that question, and it didn't bother him, and he was still for me. They still put on film every day, and he still had kosher and Shabbos and everything else. So that was a very soothing thought for me. And so ever since that day, I was a fan of the Rambam. And of course, I became more of a fan when Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg, who was my Rebbe, he was very big in learning Rambam and in being medayik, in reading closely Rambams, and I was fascinated by it. So that's it was part of my life. It was part of my life since I was, I would say, 15. And when many years later, when I wanted to deal directly away from Gemara and directly with Rambam, Mission Torah, my chavrusa said to me that, look, if you want to do it right, I think that you have to do it with. You have to first start with this introductory essay to study the prolegomenon to the Mission Torah. You have to start with the Sefer Mitzvahs, and that's how we start with the Sefer Mitzvahs. But I think the Rambam for most of my adult life has been really a fascination and an existential support to my views. And what it did for me is it enriched my thinking, my way of thinking about Judaism, my way of thinking about Torah and about Psukim and about questions in Chazal. And, I mean, even simple things like, for example, the Rambam will say, there's just throwing one example, there's 3 places the Rambam says that we know that the halacha goes according to the rov. You go according to the rov, that's halacha. And yet, Rambam says that when it comes to questions of hashkafa, he says you don't have to go by the rov. You can go by minority view. Minority view is just as important, maybe sometimes right. That's very refreshing, and that's very not only refreshing, but it's very supportive sometimes of problems that you may have. So
has your scholarly work made it easier for you to be a Fruma Yid or more difficult?
I think it has continued to enrich it. It certainly has made it better. Has made it better in that sense. Yes.
Okay, Dr. Barry.
So I was a lawyer because I had a Jewish mother. So that's why I was a lawyer. But in fact, as I was practicing, I always my passion was always actually kind of academic in the scholarly world. So I worked towards my PhD when I was practicing. When I got my PhD, I came home to my mother, and not home. I came to my mother. I said, "Mom, I'm a doctor," and she said, "That's not the doctor." But anyways, going back to the Rambam, I think that when I actually started, when we started studying the guide together, Ken and I, and another professor of philosophy at University of Toronto, who wasn't that well grounded, I think, in kind of Judaism, but brought a very deep kind of philosophical knowledge to the table. I think it was then kind of that when we first started reading, I don't want to belabor it, but I would say the sentiment that comes out of, for instance, the introduction. I mean, this when we read the introduction together, it took us probably quite a long time. We studied it for, I don't know, 5-6 years. Maybe it took us a year to do the introduction, and then again with Dov. The commitment that he demonstrated, both to his tradition and to truth, which for him are both the same in the end, just simply, captivated me. His commitment to the truth, his, to take one sentence from the introduction, and this is again going back to the question of esotericism and knowing what he's going to write. He says something like, I pretty well know this is going to get me in trouble. I know, and therefore, what do I need it for? I mean, as a rabbi, you might sympathize with it. What do I need it for? Why pursue this, right? And why the bother? Because I know people are going to, Narskite, he's going to, So he says, I'd rather, I'm paraphrasing here, I'd rather offend 10,000 ignorances than withhold the truth from one single virtuous individual. And I would say once we read that, I mean, I'm kind of capturing the moment, but that took a while, that kind of did it for me, right? So regardless of, he's just saying, regardless of the science he was dealing with, the enterprise, the search, the quest, the struggle. Because I'm a kind of a masochist. I like the struggle. I was never drawn to the comfort of religion. I never thought that religion really was there to offer you comfort. And I have no problem with the fact that it does offer some people comfort. It never did to me. And I find something attractive about that too, the grappling, the struggling. And the Rambam did that all his life, right? He never, he changed, he revised his opinions. You wouldn't expect to see the Rambam that was, 16 years old to hold the same opinions that he did when he was, much older. And so it was a constant struggle. And what it did, the final thing that really captivated for me was that his religion, his faith, is really a matter so much of human responsibility. That is, it's not, everything works from down up. That is, whatever happens with God, right? Whatever your proximity to God is, it's your job to do that. God doesn't, there's no grace, right? To use maybe a Christian-loaded term. There's no miracle. You have to work. You gain proximity to God. It's not God that comes down to you. And which is very different, by the way, than other theologies. That kind of attracted me. So I would say at the end, how does it affect my Yiddishkeit? I'm not going to answer that. But I would say the following. I think it enriches it because it allows me to always look at everything with a critical eye, which I think is in our blood. That's Yiddishkeit. I think Yiddishkeit is to look at everything with a critical eye, not just to say things by rote, to repeat things by rote. It's just when you were talking about your story, it's just what came to my mind, your story about questions about God. There's a famous, this was also got me onto the Rambam. There's a famous Yiddish writer called Chaim Grada. A lot of you may know him. And in his book, Tzemach Atlas, which was written in Yiddish, translated as the Yeshiva, he starts off the book, Tzemach Atlas is an Ilui, a guy who's like a genius in Yeshiva, genius learning Talmud all day. And he starts to have problems, the existence of God, evil in the world, creation. There are these things, philosophical problems that he wasn't getting out of the shiur. So he goes to the Rosh Yeshiva and he starts to tell the Rosh Yeshiva these problems. God exists, but what kind of a God is it? How come there's evil in the world? So the Rosh Yeshiva looks at him and says, in Yiddish, shoin tzad, tzizichin akala. So I mean, this is the answer. It's also. It's time for you to get married. It's time for you to get married. So I mean, it's facetious, but it's kind of an answer, not in all yeshivas, but in some yeshivas. That is, this is not, that's kind of narishkeit, right? Gemara, the shaklatari of Gemara, which by the way the Rambam calls davar katan, a small thing, a minor thing, and he interprets that a very different way than a lot of other people do. That is, metaphysics and physics for him is qualitatively. He's giving this a qualitative thing. So that to me always resonated, and so it enriches my Yiddishkeit in the fact that I can maybe discern sometimes what is Narishkeit and what is not Narishkeit, and I think that ultimately does make your Yiddishkeit richer.
Okay. Well, thank you very much to both of you. For the interactive part of the evening, if you do have a question, if you could just line up in the center between the two aisles, just in the back over there, we will be able to take a few questions. I'm going to switch mics with this so I can travel with this.
Well, first we'd like to, I would like to acknowledge the presence of two other great scholars that are in the audience. Dr. David Novak from the University of Toronto. It's an honor to have you here with us tonight. And Dr. Ken Green, of course, who gave the introduction. Thank you for joining us. Dr. Ken Green, you're really in the audience. We're going to have to get the first question.
I'll try to get started just because I think probably people have a lot of questions, but they're shy to come up and ask them. So one of the things that I got from it is that Rambam is there for intellectually troubled Jews, and of course the guy for the perplexed. They're for the perplexed, and in all generations, I think, since this book came out, he has answered that need. I guess the question that I would be led to by that is, yes, he's there, and that's great. What has he done, or what can he do, or what is he doing at the present for the ordinary Jews, for the masses of people? Is there a legacy of his that is broader than that? Because I think that it will always be true that sort of existential part of it is mostly for a certain type of person, probably someone who has a certain kind of education. So how would you respond to that? What is the Rambam today? What does he do for us in the Jewish world in a larger sense?
Go.
I think that his systematizing of halacha and his language on halacha is, you can see it's evident today that there's not a shtickle Torah, like they say in Esoteric, that doesn't have Rambam, right? That doesn't deal with Rambam. So what he does for today is that there's thousands and thousands of pages of halacha and psak or just understanding of sugya that draws from Rambam. So at the very least, what he's negated to us is this extraordinary way of looking at the sugyas in the Gemara and what it sheds light on the unspoken parts of halacha.
Perhaps, maybe if I put it in a nutshell, his legacy, and I personally, I think, and we've discussed this often, is that I don't know if he's won out, really. Probably he's lost, right? He's lost. But he's still around. There's still guys that are right. He's lost out to stronger currents. And the rabbi mentioned Yehuda Levi. I think those currents, Nachmanidean currents, for whatever reason, took a much stronger hold and has really won the day. But I would say that, one part of his legacy is, again, this idea of truth and Torah. That is, if somehow you can understand that truth is Torah, and there's no contradiction between the two, and not to be afraid to understand that. When I see the level of discussion sometimes, especially when it comes to science, and people are still arguing over whether the world is 6,000 years old. It's just, the Rambam would not even want to be in that discussion, right? Not to be afraid, right? Not to be afraid, and to read the Torah, right? And that there's no contradiction between our tradition and what has proven to be the case. So I would say that is a legacy that could, you don't have to be, super intellect to appreciate that. So the jury is out. We'll see. We'll see.
In the Hakdama of the Rambam to the Mishnah Torah, he says that I'm going to teach you everything about Isser and Heter and what you should do, what you don't have to do, what you shouldn't do. And I will obviate the whole need for, it seems almost the study of the Talmud, and all Paskim, it would seem. Was that, first of all, an iconoclastic position? Was he the first guy to say that? Did others say that before? And then the second part there, where he says, I'm going to obviate that, and I really want you to focus on Pardes, on study of some philosophical. Is that what the Moran Nebuchim does? And is there really in his oeuvre and in his mind this great bifurcation between doing and thinking? Not that they really sort of coalesce. Anyway, in there's some questions.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I guess maybe to rephrase the question, was the Rambam breaking with the past by saying that all you need to do is study the Yad in order to get halacha? And also, did he bifurcate between intellect and religious practice?
So let me answer the first part. I'll let Jim answer the second part. On the first part, I think that he probably was the first to say this. He made a clear statement. He said that you will not need to learn anything between the Torah and the Mishnah Torah. In other words, you can go straight from the Torah to the Mishnah Torah, and you have done Torah Shabbat Peh. And so the third part of learning, which is Talmud, he discusses in Ilchas Talmud Torah, and there he says that you can go into Pardes, you can go into Gemara. Gemara really includes philosophy. So he probably was the first to come up with that novel idea, and but that's also true because he was the first to codify it. And so he can legitimately say, I present to you everything here, and you don't have to go back to the dialectics of the Talmud.
So I would, I think he actually meant it, right? I think he actually meant it because he thought it was a waste of time to, because you need to know what to do. You need to know what to do, what not to do. Fine. I know what to do, what not to do, so I can get on to the more serious subjects. So I think he actually meant it, but that maybe is still a subject of speculation. But I don't think he actually bifurcated, thought and practice. That is, he thought that I think he strongly believed that you needed a framework, right? We are human beings, and you need a framework of conduct, morality, of ethics, and of commandments, right? That keep you on track to what is important in life in terms of the mind. So we are human beings. You can't get away from action. But he says, for instance, there what you mentioned about Pardes, he says, so what do I need? What the Havayot, what the Bible of Halacha is? Liyashvin datum shaladam, right? It calms. It gives kind of confidence. It settles the world. There's a whole other dimension of man that is political, right? That needs to be addressed. So I think for him, there's the whole human being, but everything aims at the end towards towards the life of the mind. But the life of the mind, we're not disembodied, right? We're not disembodied intellects. So it has to be within a framework that is miyashvin dat and shaladam. That's important. And so lots of scholars give very political readings of the Rambam and say that actually there is like Shlomo Pinas actually thought, one of the great scholars of Maimonides, thought that the Rambam thought you couldn't know anything in the end about God. So actually it's the political that's the most important for the Rambam. So I'm not quite sure there's a bifurcation.
All right, we'll take, I think we just have two more questions, because I know some people have to get up early tomorrow, so let's take two more questions.
Just one for each, so whoever wants to answer. Why, if the Untitled Chapter was the introduction essay, why would it be written in Arabic and the Mishnah Torah in Hebrew? And also, if you could comment on the significance of the number 14 for the Rambam. And for you, if in the introduction to the Burden book, he mentions that before you go into the secrets of the law, you have to know the law. How, for a person like the Rambam, who is obviously proficient in that, how justified is more to move from study kind of thing for most people who study it, which are not proficient in the law?
Okay.
So the question is, why did he write in Arabic the Sefer Mitzvot? And he wrote, everything he wrote was in Arabic, except for the Mishnah Torah. And he has a big discussion in the introduction in the Sefer Mitzvot saying, I want to, if I write in Hebrew, it has to be a special Hebrew. It's not biblical Hebrew, it's Mishnaic Hebrew with some, his Hebrew is really an innovation, a grammatical innovation. And I think it was very comfortable writing in Arabic, and that was the language used by the population. It's like writing today in English. If you want people to read it, you write it in English.
So the Mishnah Torah
But the Mishnah Torah was already written for scholars and poskim, and they knew Hebrew. And by the way, it's very interesting that he translates every single term that the Gemara uses in Aramaic. He will translate to Hebrew, so it's pure Hebrew, and it's a beautiful Hebrew, really beautiful Hebrew. But the popular works are written in Arabic, and so are the letters, so are the Shuvot written in Arabic. So I think that he wanted people to read. What was the second question about 14? What about 14?
What's the significance?
Yad.
That's it. I'm saying
Yeah, I don't.
Shoroshim or something in the Sefer.
In the Shoroshim, it's also 14, and so is the Yad HaChazak with 14.
And there's 14, not just...
Yeah,
Sevens.
I think
Sevens.
that, what
Leo Strauss.
Leo Strauss had something to say about...
Says that the guide is also structured around sevens.
Yeah. He had another couple of pieces. For example, I think that Shorish 7, he says, is a tovech, is a pillar of the Shroshim, and it happens to be in the middle, right? It's 7. So there may be some truth to that he played a little bit with numbers.
And your question again was...
If you had to study the law in order to understand the secrets of the law, how is it justified really for most people to study the Mordor without having, at least on that level of...
What's the justification to study the guide before you study the whole law?
No, I agree. I think that you start. And he says this with his regimen in terms of in Hilchot Talmud Torah, where the laws of learning Torah. He talks about how you structure your day and how you should, gradually, get to pardes. So I don't disagree. That I think he he's aiming, and he actually describes the audience that he's targeting in the beginning of the guide as people who are firmly entrenched in the law, but also firmly entrenched in philosophy. So it's both, actually, right? You need to be proficient in the law, but you need to be proficient in philosophy as well, right? And then the book is written. So you're absolutely right. I don't think it's a book that you can just pick up.
All right, last question.
Thank you. This question is addressed to anybody, but I think Rabbi Krofkin might be in a position perhaps to answer it better than the other two scholars. Both of our authors explain the impact that the Rambam had on just about every aspect of Jewish life, whether it's philosophical or halachically. With regards to halacha, I would probably put, historically, I put Rashi in the same category. But my question is, how does God work? Like, all of this happened through one individual who obviously was brilliant, extremely capable, and very prolific, and obviously put in a lot of hard work, 23 hours a day. How does this happen historically? Does God say, oh, thank God Moshe came along, because how else would Jewish history develop the way I wanted to? Or would he just make sure that there's someone else instead of one of these two people? Like, how does that work philosophically and theologically?
These two people?
No.
Rashi and
Rambam.
Thank you, Ezra.
I think that's addressed to you.
Oh, am I the more theologian of the three? I'm not sure whether I'm adequate to answer the question. I'll certainly would love to hear the other responses, but I had not asked. One of the questions that I wanted to ask was try and imagine a Jewish world without a Rambam. What would it look like? And then I sort of realized that that's a bit of a silly question, because from a fatalistic standpoint, that the Eibush Kafir the Welt, as they say, God wanted there to be a Rambam. God wanted there to be a Rashi. And we are taught that, from a number of svarim, that God opens floodgates of knowledge at different eras, different epochs in Jewish history. So the knowledge that needed to open up in the 11th century was opened by Rashi. The knowledge that needed to open in the 12th century was opened up by the Rambam, and so forth and so on, to the point where we are all the richer today because of individual, brilliant people who dedicated their lives to the teaching of Torah, but also from a theological standpoint, if I may, not from a scholarly standpoint. The Almighty choreographs the world, and part of the choreography is the opening up of areas of knowledge via different shlichim, via different emissaries to bring that knowledge to the world. So thank God we have a Rambam, and thank God we have a Rashi, and thank God we have these two wonderful authors that are here tonight. I'm told that with the exception of the Hebrew book of Dr. Friedberg, we are sold out. So why don't you just tell us quickly, before you say anything else, how people can order your books either online or somewhere else on the black market somewhere?
No, my books can be found in Beirut. Actually, the Amazon sells the books.
Amazon.com is a good...
Okay, here.
And the soft cover you should use.
My first two books you can get. My third book, forget it, because my publishers have decided in their wisdom to consign it to oblivion by charging $100 for it. Trust me, I don't get 1 cent of it, so don't buy it. Don't buy it. Get it out of the library. I should have called it Steal This Book, like the 60s, those will know what that references to. Or wait for the paperback. It will be out in paperback.
Okay, so, yes.
Firstly, thank you for a wonderful evening. It was very instructive. The question I have is, would the Rambam agree with Rabbi Koropkin's answer to the last question?
And on that note, we wish you all a wonderful evening.